Welcome to the Community Development Podcast, a podcast dedicated to community development practice and approaches, sharing our learning and connecting the workforce. My name is Russell. Welcome back, it's been a while. Quick plug for the previous episode, which was with Becky Halford, co-founder and director of Benefit Cymru, talking about library things, and we caught up 5 years after first chatting to one another about the Benefit Cymru project in Wales, and where I found myself, keep myself busy as well from time to time. We're heading back to Ireland with this episode for the first time in probably about 3 or 4 years actually, since we were speaking with Mark McPheeters at the University of Ulster, where we were discussing the sort of the interface and the overlap and the relationship and the connections between youth and community work and community development. Before that, we first visited Ireland when we spoke with Johnny Curry, a community worker in East Belfast, or at least was a community worker in East Belfast. He's involved, again, he's got a slightly different role these days, but I'm sure he's still calling on and falling back on his community development and community work discipline and training and practice and experience. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'm really pleased to welcome to the podcast Dónal Traynor, who is the Chief Executive of Community Finance Ireland. Welcome to the podcast, Dónal.
Thanks for having me, Russell.
And where are you calling from?
So I'm calling from County Meath, which is in the Republic of Ireland, and I'm just about 40 minutes drive west of Dublin, but I'm originally from another neighbouring county, Cavan, which straddles the border with Northern Ireland.
Yeah, and as I say, welcome to the podcast, Dónal. Looking forward to getting into the skin a little bit of some of the research reports into social value of your community investments in Ireland in due course. But before we do that, we have another guest, and I would like to extend a very warm welcome to Conor McGale from the Rose Regeneration Trust. Welcome to the podcast, Conor.
Hi Russell, thanks for having me.
And whereabouts are you calling from?
I'm based in Omagh, Tyrone in Northern Ireland. So we're about 70 miles west of Belfast and about 45 minutes away from the border to the Republic of Ireland as such.
So Conor, how did you find yourself in this work, involved in sort of the research within the social economy or the social sector in its broadest sense? As I've said on numerous occasions on this podcast, I sort of fell into community work. You know, to what extent is that your experience too?
Pretty much very similar, Russell. I started working in the volunteer community sector. I'm showing my age now. Back in 1994, working first of all in a welfare rights centre, and throughout the course of a number of years, took on a various number of roles within the community and voluntary sector, whether it's management of a community centre, community facility, involved in some cross-border training roles, assisting organisations in the rural areas in Northern Ireland. And for the last number of years, the whole concept around impact and value, around evaluation have come around with regards to groups. So that's what's happened there.
And how about yourself, Dónal? I mean, as Chief Executive of Community Finance Ireland, I suppose most listeners can form an impression as to what your role is, you know, leading a team, answering to the board, working to the board, and so on. But how have you found yourself in this role?
Serendipitous enough route, Russell. I left college and went to manage a number of couple of different social enterprises in Cavan in the Republic. In 1999, I was visited by the first chief executive of an organisation called Ulster Community Investment Trust, who came into my office and inquired about refinancing existing debt that we had with that social enterprise. That deal never happened. My life then developed into a career where I was helping people get back into the workforce, confidence building, interview skills, helping them find careers, etc. And during that period of time, I came across an advertisement for a job with Ulster Community Investment Trust, which would have sought to get somebody with community development expertise operating and managing a cross-border community enterprise programme, and it was the first of its kind, covering the 12 counties, Northern Ireland and the 6 southern border counties. So applied, and I got that job with, would you believe, Ulster Community Investment Trust as it was known then. So I did that for about 4 years, staying with the company then when that that role was finished, my role developed into developing a lending portfolio for what was ostensibly a social finance provider operating exclusively in Northern Ireland up until that point. So this was their first foray into the Republic in terms of social finance, and so I was employed on my own in a subsidiary company registered in the Republic at the time, and the rest, as I say, is history. I've been with the organisation 20 years now, and it's been very exciting, but that was the route to it.
And already, Dónal, there's a couple of words you've used there, investment, for example, that may not be words that are part of a community worker's day-to-day lexicon. And if they are, maybe they use them in a very kind of narrow sort of social context of investment, perhaps, rather than, balance sheets and returns on investments, dividends, and all that kind of talk and all that kind of vocabulary. Debt is another one, and maybe that's a word that the average community worker might wish to run a mile from. But one phrase we are going to use a lot in this conversation is a social value. So is there an accepted definition for it? Or is it contested maybe within the sector, across sectors, across different jurisdictions?
I suppose we don't go internally in what's now known as Community Finance Ireland. I mentioned Ulster Community Investment Trust. We had a rebranding in 2020 to Community Finance Ireland. That's where the name came from. We've always had a small list of criteria for our social finance investments. One of them would be that the organisations we were lending money to had to have a not-for-profit clause in their governing documents. The second one, obviously, that they would have to have an authority to borrow in their rules. The third one is that they would have to have repayment capacity, which is very, very important from a sustainability perspective. And the fourth one was that we would have to see immediate social impact post the dispersal of the funds, immediate social impact. So where you might have an instance where you wouldn't have immediate social impact, we might have an organisation that would be borrowing money to buy land on the understanding that at some point in the near future, grant facilities will become available that they will be able to develop that land. So that's kind of speculative investment that we don't get involved in. We want to see the money working as soon as it hits the ground. So we always, to us, social value was quite obvious. We said, look, we'll put money on the ground. This organisation will create more childcare places, will increase the availability of enterprise space, will enhance the sporting facilities in the local area, will enhance the communal hub facilities. Those sort of things to us were obvious social impact. And we didn't see the need really to be measuring and competing, because we're in a grant space where there's a competitive amount of there's a limited amount of funds and it's a competitive process. We can understand there where social impact A needs to be compared with social impact B. But for us, where it isn't a competition and there's adequate capital go around for everybody, and we intend it to be a continuous revolving loan fund, once we're not scratching our heads looking for social impact, we're happy that that ticks that box. However, throughout our experience and our history of late, we've come to realise that internationally, social impact is becoming more and more important. And I think the whole introduction of philanthropy into the social finance space internationally, this is a very important reason as to why social impact is becoming more and more valued. Now all of a sudden, you'll have community development organisations, social enterprises, charities. They will be seeking to partner up with corporates. And these corporates are going to be very particular about where they put their money. And they will in turn want to be able to hang their hat on some credible evidence as to the impact that their corporate donations are having. And I suppose when we started looking at that and the importance that philanthropy or corporate support may play in terms of a part of Community Finance Ireland into the future, we decided back in 2022 to start talking to Conor and the guys in Rose Regeneration about getting a handle on this social impact that we facilitate. Let's face it, we're enabling communities to enable themselves. The money that we have is a vehicle for communities on the ground to make that difference to society locally and regionally. And so we wanted to be able to say, well, look, if we go to a government department, an international philanthropist, a large-scale corporate, to say, look, we know what our money is doing on the ground, and there's the scientific evidence to prove it. That's really where our journey, where social value and how it started to kind of develop more so than what it would have been before, Russell.
So you mentioned grants there, and I guess typically, I'm generalising a lot here, I guess, but typically most community workers listening to this will be familiar with grant-giving organisations. They might be funded via public bodies or lottery or European sources of finance. They might be funded by private trusts, but that money is being awarded to them in a grant capacity that they do not have to repay. Is it as simple a distinction, or for the benefit of this conversation, that the difference between those grants typically that their listeners to this as community workers will be familiar with and the money that you're talking about, the loans you're talking about is that the loans are to be repaid?
It's as simple as that, and we're very careful about the language that we use. And when we talk about grants, we talk about grant funding. Yeah. So when we talk about finance, we talk about social finance. So we don't say social funding and we don't say grant finance, because that starts mixing the whole thing up. And a very good example of that, we did a piece of research with DCU over here in the Republic back about 2 years ago. We surveyed about 200 social enterprises in Ireland, and 50% of them said that when they hear the phrase social finance, they think about grants immediately. And I suppose that brings us then back to the whole other story about, look at the sector that we support is very, very varied. We have a very diversified portfolio. So we will invest money in a football club. We'll invest money in a community-owned hotel. We'll invest money in a community-owned hospital. We'll invest money in a tourism facility. But across that whole portfolio, there are what are known as community services, and you will have social enterprise at the other end of the spectrum, and in between you will have community services that develop some form of traded income in their activities. And what we would say is community services, that's the place for grants. That's, they'll continuously be looking for handouts from the local communities who see the benefit in terms of community service they provide, and that's a space for grant supports. At the other end of the spectrum, you have very little fundraising going on, very little grant support, and it's 100% earned income. And then in the middle, you've got these hybrids, which make up a lot of our portfolio. So 43% of the money that we lend out goes into sporting facilities. And so they will get access to some grants, but they will also raise money, fundraising from the local community. And finally, then they may have gyms or bars, or they will have a lotto scheme that they will do that will also bring in income. So we're very varied in terms of what we do, but we understand that, grants are available for everybody, but we want to encourage people to reduce their level of grant dependency and to move on into a space of self-sustainability, because only when you do that do you become completely autonomous and become most adaptable to change as society changes and the needs of society changes, and you can be a real community development enterprise. So there's
They use the word autonomy, I think, I find quite striking. I mean, it's almost, if you do equate organisational development with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's that self-actualisation of an organisation that is no longer, hanging on a piece of string of other organisations or funders or government or public bodies or whatever. They've outgrown some of those constraints, but I guess that's also a position that an awful lot of organisations perhaps struggle, maybe ever, to attain. So yeah, they use the word autonomy. I think yeah, fascinating.
If you want to stay true to your mission and what it is that your community wants, you have to be cognizant of the fact that, as you put it, if you take the king's shilling, whoever pays the piper plays the tune, and you may have to distort yourself and the service provision that you're offering to fit the criteria around grant supports, and that's not a space that we would kind of condone to be chasing.
Okay, so Conor, where do we start then in terms of the methodologies? We're going to go and look to measure this thing called social value. How do we do it? What are the methodologies? Where do we start?
What we do with social value for Rose Regeneration is that basically we use the social return of investment methodology. So that falls down with regards to involving a number of principles that we use in terms of how you try to calculate the social value of a project. So the principles that we would use with social value, and it'd be recognised by Social Value UK and Social Value International, would be around involving your stakeholders, speaking to people who are involved in the project, whether it's at management or delivery level, and also at the coal face in terms of beneficiaries or clients or service users. Understanding what's changed, what has been the situation before that person, for example, might have used that service. What is the result now as a regarding of using that service? Making sure you only include the material or include information that is relevant and also that you can absolutely capture. So data is very important here, whereby organizations or individuals are able to sort of make it very clear the difference that service may have with them. It's also been including what matters, what's the most important thing for that person. Is it about improved well-being? Is it about improved access to services? Is it about improved employment opportunities, etc., etc., etc.? And then we verify the result really in terms of that. So there's 8 principles of social value that we would use. We go through the various stages. Essentially, it comes down to basically data. It comes down to both quantitative and qualitative data. So the quantitative data we would look for is about how many people have access services, how many people are maybe availing of a particular type of project or a particular type of access in a local social group or access in a local facility, and trying then to break them down into type of categories of organizations. So for our people, for example, is it particularly lone parents? Is it particularly elderly? Is it particularly, for example, people suffering from mental health illnesses, people trying to improve their physical health, etc., etc.? So we try and involve as many stakeholders that we have and try and get that data in terms of a quantitative element. Then what we try to do is try to break that down further and to try and get the qualitative data really, the difference in terms of what that impact of that service has had on them. And we do that via way of either surveys, telephone interviews, stakeholder interviews, focus groups, and that, which has become very, very popular as well too, about people being able to voice their opinion. And once we do that, we use a tool, an online tool essentially, that helps calculate social return of investment. The SROI methodology can be somewhat complicated, particularly for organisations that might not use social value particularly quite a lot. But we have an online tool called the Social Value Engine that helps basically a lot of organizations do that work themselves. Some organizations may want to bring in an independent verifier like ourselves to do this, but quite a lot of our groups and a lot of our organizations that we work with have access to the engine also themselves. So they're able to do that calculation along with that.
You've preempted one of my questions there, Conor. To what extent do we wish to build, can we build the capacity of organisations to be able to measure and demonstrate the social value that they're having, rather than people coming in from outside to do it? We talk about doing ourselves out of a job in the old cliche, but presumably that's something we would want to do, and I guess that's where the engine comes in, and it's accessible on the website, I guess, and so
Absolutely.
on. It comes back to that autonomy point again, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is. One of the reasons why whenever I was doing some work previously in the past with some rural organisations, a lot of the groups that we work with were sort of saying, well, look, we know what we're having a massive impact in the area that we serve, but how do we demonstrate that? And also, how do we demonstrate that in a way that doesn't compromise our principles? So, for example, a lot of funders will look at it about showing value for money, and they will look at it at very hard finance figures. But a lot of community and voluntary sector organisations have more softer outcomes, as I call them, Russell, where that's basically about what is the impact that service has had. Or that facility has had on the person as an individual. Has it improved their social isolation? It doesn't mean there that they're more socially interactive with people of their own age or people from other areas or even from different cultures in some cases. And also as well too, has it as a result of using that service, has it improved their mental health? Has it improved their physical health? Have they been able to develop skills as it evolved in terms of maybe availing of training of some type? So I kind of coined a phrase around doing this work around value for money, is that it's like the touchy-feely cost-benefit analysis. And what that essentially means is that it's not just looking at things in a pure financial terms. You're looking at outcomes for that individual on a more broader scale that goes beyond money. Yes, the monetary element is important for funders in terms of for value for money, and also particularly, I think, for a lot of organisations in terms of if they're getting grant support or social finance support, they're wanting to demonstrate, look, we're worth it. Essentially, this is what we're doing in our local area or with our local people in terms of helping them develop maybe new skills or maybe improve their way of life as such. So the engine, I think, has a very much a community development approach whereby that yes, we're asked by organizations to come in and maybe do an independent analysis on a project social value, but organizations can take the engine and do the work themselves. And what we have done with a lot of our VCSE clients is that we have helped them go through the process and then have sort of verified the result after they've done this work themselves. So it's a two-way process in terms of helping groups maybe determine themselves where identifying maybe what services they're having that's having the most impact as well as maybe ourselves telling them as a result of an independent analysis.
Does it help surface things that weren't expected, that weren't set out to be achieved? They're those sort of unintended outcomes, those unintended consequences, or things that they didn't realise were going on because they'd never asked the question about those things. Sometimes I think there's always a danger you can kind of tunnel yourself when you're looking at the valuation. Let's just focus on the things that we're measuring, whereas there's other things that might lie outside of that tunnel, for want of a better metaphor maybe. But if you don't ask the question, you don't necessarily hear back about those things. So there's kind of the unintendedness of what we do in this messy, awkward elbows arena of called community. Does it help surface some of that as well, Conor?
Yeah, absolutely. There is an option on the engine that allows groups to determine whether or not the outcome they've chosen is an intended or an unintended outcome. Exactly that term of phrase that you use, Russell. So it allows groups to do that. And how groups are able to identify that is that along with the way SROI works is that what you're trying to do is monetize your outcomes. What you're trying to do is place a financial value on the type of work that you're doing. The engine has around 370 to 400 proxies that are basically publicly available pieces of research that gives a financial value for a particular community intervention. So, for example, we would have proxies in the engine about the value of volunteering, the value of being part of a social group, the value of improved physical health, improved mental health, the value of improved physical exercise, for example. And what you kind of find whenever you're working with organisations, and certainly with a lot of the organisations that we did as part of the Community Finance Ireland analysis, is that groups will say, well, we definitely do that, but we also now have evidence to show that that proxy there about maybe, for example, improving mental health, which might have been not their first primary aim, but their second or third aim, they also now have evidence to back that up. So you kind of find that when groups goes through this process around social value, whilst they identify the unintended outcomes, and sometimes that can lead to offshoots of other projects that they might go and say, well, that's one of the results of what's happened with this project. Maybe there's a service or maybe there's a project that we need to deliver, and maybe I get a funding for in terms of help addressing that identified issue in the area. So yeah, I think it's a great tool for organisations to help them that they do their own research, for want of a better word, that they're able to determine what their own community's needs are based on maybe the usage of their community facility or maybe the usage of their service. And as a result of that, it helps shape their future work going forward.
Before we get into some of the work specifically you've been doing together, Dónal, might it help listeners to have explained to them a little bit more detail, a bit more clarity, the more sort of jurisdictional and governmental arrangements here? Ireland is maybe a little bit more complicated than other areas, notwithstanding we have devolution in the UK. So I might work on I was evaluating a community renewal fund project last year that was UK government funded straight from London. Most of what I've tended to work on previously has been originated from the Welsh government in Cardiff. But presumably when you talk about finance and there's two sovereign states covering Ireland, there's different compliance and things like that. Part of it is in the European Union, part of it isn't. What's the jurisdictional context that Community Finance Ireland is working with?
We think it's fairly straightforward ourselves. We're so used to it over the last 20 odd years. But yeah, for your listeners, so we have two jurisdictions, Northern Ireland with a population of about 1.5 million people. And then we have the Republic of Ireland, which is probably about 3.5 times, and it's larger in terms of geographical size, with a population of about 5 million people. We originally set up the organisation in Northern Ireland as an industrial and province society, and the business model to date has been accessing funding for free. We took over a bad debt portfolio back at the turn of the century worth about 6.5 million sterling. And made that bad debt portfolio good. And as a result, we've been recycling that 6.5 million sterling along with another £4 million that we got from the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development around 2004, about 3.5 times over the last 20 years. So we've put 43 million sterling on the ground in Northern Ireland in terms of social finance. It had always been our intention to operate on an all island basis, but the source of the original funds restricted our ability to work on a cross-border basis. So in 2004, there was a southern subsidiary established so that I could be employed in the Republic and develop the cross-border business support programme. Fast forward then to 2007, 2008, when that programme came to an end, and we developed a lending portfolio in the Republic. The difference being our business model in the Republic is we buy money in off the Irish banks through an intermediary for onward lending. So we buy at a price, at an interest rate. We take a margin for ourselves in terms of our running costs, risk cover, potential deficits, etc. And we lend then on at a margin to grassroots community across the Republic. So that's the way we've been operating for the last 16 years in the Republic. Different currencies, euro in the south, pound sterling in Northern Ireland. We have central bank requirements in terms of reporting to a central credit register in the Republic. Different requirements in Northern Ireland. We have another company, a subsidiary in Northern Ireland that's FCA regulated specifically for the purpose of managing a private SME loan fund on behalf of InvestNI, and we've been doing that for the last 10 or 11 years. And that's worked out very well for us as well. And then we have a number of boards. Obviously, our parent body has a board of voluntary trustees who are made up of individuals from both Northern Ireland and the Republic. And then we have a southern board for our operations in the Republic, and that too has trustees, voluntary trustees from both sides of the border. So everything that we do, we try to do on an all-island basis. There are instances whereby, however, that's not always possible. I give the example. We've recently been awarded a £13 million injection of capital from an innovative instrument called Financial Transactions Capital, which has made its way from the Treasury in London over through into Northern Ireland and the Department of Finance. It's filtered down through the Department for Communities, who have sponsored us as a private enterprise for on-lending of this 13 million sterling over the next 3 years, exclusively within Northern Ireland. So that's to give you an example of some of the restrictions about some of the instruments that we operate on a jurisdiction basis. To be honest, Russell, the only thing that communities need to know is that we've got access to the capital. We lend exclusively to that market, so it's a niche market for us. We're specialists in community lending. It's all we do, and that we will handhold them through the process. We understand that nobody gets involved in community development work ever expecting that they're going to have to take on debt finance at some point. But the reality is that invariably at some stage of the process, if you want to, develop your growth ambition to a scale that maybe grant funding and local fundraising by itself is not going to be enough to get projects across the line. And that's where we come in, because heretofore, generally, the conventional banking system is not compatible with voluntary-led organisations, perhaps no security of any tangible value, and the reputational risk for perhaps the banks if something goes wrong in terms of local PR, etc. So we're there to solve all those problems and to work as a voluntary-led organisation, a registered charity and social enterprise with other organisations of the same makeup as ourselves. And that's what we're all about.
That's really, really, really helpful. So the report that you worked on together, and indeed I think are now working on would it be a follow-up or a building on, or is it, again, please clarify, but was looking at the social value impact of Community Finance Ireland over a period of, I think, 2 to 3 years, and that came out in 2021, I think.
So we had originally, Russell, intended on doing a social value report for 2022. That's when we got with Conor and the guys in Rose Regeneration on board. And when we looked at it, of course, the whole COVID thing came into perspective as well. And with COVID came uncertainty. With lockdowns came uncertainty about the potential for these community-based facilities to open up, when they were going to open up, etc. That had a knock-on impact on confidence among voluntary-led boards in terms of taking out debt finance to get projects across the line. There was a lot of holding one's breath and waiting to see what comes next. And so as a result, Conor, when he looked at it, and his colleague Ivan Hannibal, when they looked at it, they decided, well, maybe we can bulk in a lot of the activity that happened across 19, 20 and 21. But there's about an 18, 20, 21 month period there that they covered to get as much emphasis on what really is ostensibly is a baseline. It's our first report. It's the starting point. And I already know that the stuff that Conor's been doing with his colleagues for our 2023 report will be building very much upon that.
And that's kind of what I was getting at. Is it a follow on? Is it building on the data and that baseline that's been identified for the first time? If I'm right, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we're coming to this like very, very naive, uninformed. We hand it over to the experts in Rose Regeneration and we say, lads, there's the data. Do whatever you need to do. Come back to us and tell us where we sit. Because we've seen social impact reports in the past internationally with people coming back with a 1,500% return on investment and, almost making a mockery of the thing, and we want to see, well, if we have to say that the results that came out, and Conor will allude to it now later on, when we showed them to the stakeholders, government departments, north and south, to finance agencies, etc., they looked and it was probably the most credible report they've ever seen. That was very important for us because now we're first mover advantage. Now we were the first social finance provider to actually do that on an all-island basis, and so now others are asking, well, how do you do that? And I know Rose Regeneration have got a lot of inquiries on the back of that stuff. So, we want to stay true to that. We would like to see the social value engine being a model of best practice for social value analysis in Ireland, on the island generally, because it stands to us that these guys know what they're at.
Yeah, sure. So Conor, talk us through this 2021 report. Dónal referred to the pandemic. Clearly was an aggravating factor, I'm sure, and complicated a few things and shifted a lot of interaction online, no doubt, like it did for the rest of us. But tell us a bit more about the 21 report.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it was like COVID was very much prevalent whenever we were carrying out this work, and particularly a lot of the organisations that we spoke to were very, very keen to emphasise it. So, for process, there was a twofold process. First of all, was looking entirely at CFI's loan portfolio. So that is the amount of loans that they've given out, the type of loans that they've given out, and also to the type of organisations, broken down by in terms of themes, the type of organisations that were assisted, and also with regards to where that organisation was based on the island, whether it's within the four provinces, etc., and also the type of category of organisation. So that was the first bit. So we went through the data internally and tried to match the data, as I alluded to earlier, with the proxies that we have in the engine that would match the type of organisations we have. So, for example, there was quite a lot of sporting organisations that were involved in terms of availing of support. There was quite a lot of faith organisations, heritage groups, social enterprises, environmental projects, tourism initiatives, etc., community facilities. And we have quite a lot of proxies in the engine that we were able to match that up with the data that the guys had. So that was the first phase. The second phase, which was a qualitative element of it, is whereby we spoke to around 30 or 40 of Community Finance Ireland's clients in terms of trying just essentially to determine the impact that the support that they availed of from CFI, what the difference that has made to their locality, their location, their organisation, the people that they serve, etc., etc. So when you do this type of work, you kind of have to apply deflators essentially. And what I mean by that is that you can't say 100% because you've got a grant that the project has been a success or it's purely down to that. There may be other mitigating factors. There could be, for example, other finance organisations that the organisation may be assisting them. There may be other reasons why the project has been a success locally. There may be other projects that's in the area that might be detrimental to the impact that the project that CFI are supporting may have. And also there may be drop-off. So, for example, it might be that there's a community facility that a person might be availing of for a training course for over maybe 6 to 9 months. And then after that, when they stop going, they lose them skills. So we set up a series of interviews, of a series of virtual focus groups, essentially, really, in terms of talking to key people within each of these organisations, both in terms of management of the organisations, but also in terms of their service users. And from that, we were able to get some specific information about the impact that that facility or that service or that organisation has had on them, about how it's impacted maybe on whether it's about their well-being, whether physical or mental, whether it's helped in terms of getting people back into the workplace, maybe improving that organisation's own capacity in terms of being a social enterprise. Maybe it's improved their own business, improvement in terms of turnover and that as well. So we did quite a lot of interviews with regards to that, how vital essentially Community Finance Ireland support was for a lot of these organisations, particularly during COVID, where capital funding, which a lot of these organisations needed, basically wasn't available. And therefore, organisations we have found have been very, very creative and now willing to look outside the box essentially in terms of finding other means of funding their project in order to help their local communities and that as well. And the other thing I should have also mentioned, Russell, is what's is kind of important around this piece of work is that the engine is very much place based. There are two outcomes frameworks that's in the engine that sort of helps you determine what that project's or impact is against the area with regards to whether making that area as more sustainable and more better connected community as such. One is a Bristol Accord, which isn't really that familiar with regards to groups in Ireland. It's more familiar with a number of groups in the UK, which outlines 8 key themes of what makes a community sustainable. But in terms for the Community Finance Ireland analysis, our proxies are correlated against the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which is very much a framework that a lot of groups in Ireland, both north and south, are very familiar with and actually report their objectives against as well. So as a result of that, we were able to give Community Finance Ireland what we felt was a really robust and credible social value and return of the investment that they're putting into communities right across the island, but also about what that impact is having in terms of local areas via using it through the Sustainable Development Goals.
And I'll make a link in the show notes to the report. It's not a lengthy report. It's 17, 18 pages. Helpful graphic as well that sets out the sustainability goals that you're referring to there, Conor. And I got a report here in front of me as I sort of scroll through. And there is a wide range of organisations. Hillside Evangelical Church, so clearly a faith group. You've got, there's a food co-op here. That's in Dublin. You've got a property trust in Downpatrick. And it sets out as well what they wanted the finance for. So there's development of paths, there's museums, there's obviously a lot going into facilities and services, employability you've alluded to there a little bit earlier, Conor. And I'm sure all of these investments in your portfolio, they're probably like children, Dónal. Yeah, you're not allowed to have a favourite, I'm sure. But are you, is there any, you're able to maybe pick one or two out and just maybe provide a little bit of a, additional kind of colour and flavour to some of these for listeners?
Yeah, there's some lovely stories, all right, yeah. A couple that spring to mind, we had a very large social housing estate in Monaghan, which is again straddles the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. There's about 500 houses in this housing estate, and for years and years and years it had operated a very successful community resource centre, and it was itself was positioned at the back of a grocery shop, delicatessen off licence shop owned by an elderly couple who lived next door to it, etc. And we had a thing called the Celtic Tiger, which has gone down in the annals of history here in Ireland, where there was a property boom. And during that period of time, a developer offered the elderly couple that owned the shop a sizable amount of money to sell the land associated and all the property to him. So he eventually got held up in terms of planning regulations, and by the time ran out, basically the boom went, and the land became worthless, and the bank ultimately sold it, receiver sold it to who other than the local family resource centre, and they bought it for maybe €150,000 at the time, stuff like that. But the purpose behind them buying was to access a commercial unit that they could develop as a social enterprise, i.e. the shop. So we were asked to come in and help them get that shop up and running again. Now, just to set context, prior to this, the Family Resource Centre had been providing training, which led to qualifications for people from this estate to work in various kind of retail type businesses. However, their address was going against them. So when they started going looking for commercial work experience in the real commercial world, we'll say, their address was letting them down, and they were finding it very difficult to get that real life commercial work experience. So by purchasing this property and by purchasing this business, the Family Resource Centre now had a real live working environment in which to put these trainees into. And ultimately, our investment helped develop 17 jobs in that local community. And these kids were getting this real life work experience to follow on from their qualifications and prepare them better for going out. They weren't now having to rely on their address, they were relying on their last employer, etc. And that was a very, very important step in the process in regenerating that little fold. Another organisation that I often think of is faith-based related. And so, whereas the Republic of Ireland would have been heavily dominated by the Catholic Church over the last couple of centuries, more recently we see a shift away from the established churches to evangelical and Pentecostal type churches. And one example would have been a Romanian community of 1,200 adults who obtained a 999-year lease on corporation grounds in Dublin. And they set about planning the development of a very large church-like structure or faith-based structure for their community. Now, ultimately, they developed and tendered out the construction of an €8.5 million building with 1,500 individual seats, conference facilities, meeting rooms, childcare places, etc. in this space. But instead of actually getting a contractor in, they established their own construction company, employed 18 people from within their congregation on a full-time basis, hired first and then bought machinery and plant, and developed the project themselves to all required planning standards. And on every weekend would have 35 to 40 volunteers from their congregation helping the tradesmen at the weekend developing this building. And over the course of 4 years, this magnificent piece of infrastructure came to light. And just there in 2022, I think Christmas 2022, they had their first Christmas services in the property. And it's amazing to see what can be done. They didn't get any grant support. We loaned them finance. They quickly repaid down that debt finance because of their habit of giving. For a lot of us here in Ireland, we're supposed to be a generous race, but my goodness, these people will teach you about giving, and because in their understanding is that the more you give, you will get multiple in terms of getting back. So they would be two very important examples that I would offer in terms of the diversity. When I joined in 2004, Russell, 97% of our money was invested in community-owned enterprise and workspace units. As I said, today we're 43% invested in sport. So there's been a significant transition away from where we would originally have been to now continuously looking to push the boundaries in terms of the organisations that we get involved with.
And if you were to maybe look ahead to the future, say the next 10 years with Community Finance Ireland, where do you perhaps see the parts of the social economy perhaps that you can see yourselves kind of growing into more and then beginning to maybe take an increasing share of your portfolio?
Despite the fact that we haven't yet scratched the surface of the potential investment in sport, I am very cognizant of the fact that 43% is a heavily weighted concentration level in favour of that space. Personally, I would love to see us get more involved in environmental projects, social enterprises, tackling climate change. The difficulty is that up until this point at least, there haven't been a whole pile of projects put on our desk with sufficient repayment capacity to justify the investment. And whether that's because public policy just isn't structured such to encourage or to facilitate the development of sustainable social enterprise in that regard, I'm not so sure. But that's where I would like to see us getting heavily involved in green social enterprise with real strong, robust repayment streams coming to satisfy our own investment criteria.
Interesting. And Conor, I mean, in terms of coming at it from the research, the evaluative perspective with respect to social value, do you see maybe the methodologies being refined in some way or getting more sophisticated, or I'm not quite sure what the term is, but do you see some change there happening? Maybe if you're doing this work in 10 years' time, is it the same tools you're using or do you anticipate some change and evolution?
I think there might be some change, Russell. I don't think it'll be too major. I think what you will kind of find is that as opposed to maybe what's happened in the past, and CFI has certainly sort of broken the mold in terms of a lot of organisations, and that as well too. I think a lot of the organisations now start to take social impact and social values really seriously, and it's not just enough to have that glossy report on an infographic that outlines the impact. Yes, that's really important, and that's key, but also what Dónal and the team have done from this, and we've seen this with a lot of our other clients and a lot of groups that we work with, is about, okay, so how do we build from this? So it's sometimes you see reports clarifying impact that's put away to the shelf and never seen again. But it's pretty clear from say the work that we've done with CFI and with a lot of our clients, it's a continual sort of building in terms of trying to delve a bit deeper and into impact, trying to delve a bit deeper into making sure about, trying to measure what matters for that individual and also for that person. I think we've done some work around the sustainable development goals around the value of community and making a community more better, well served, better connected, training a workforce to be able to live remotely as such like that. I think there will be more work around the methodology to try and really ring fence that type of work and really try to emphasize the importance of it, but that it becomes a bit more mainstream. So therefore, the economic value of that is recognized on that. And I think we're seeing more and more work and more research carried out that's not just given about economic value of maybe, for example, the larger businesses. You're seeing it now with a lot of social enterprises, a lot of voluntary and community sector organisations, and I think that's good, and that it gives other organisations in the sector that benchmark, not to compare like with like, but also to ensure that they're also now on equal footing whenever it comes about demonstrating their social impact of a community development organisation or of a grassroots group, in terms of that they're also demonstrating impact just as much as maybe one of the large multinationals are.
I mean, if someone who's listening to this and they're a community worker doing community development work, maybe the parts of the the English speaking world or in the UK or wherever, indeed in Ireland perhaps, and they're thinking, okay, this is maybe something we don't get involved in usually, maybe have never got involved in these forms of finance. What would be a sort of like the small ask that you might make of them, Dónal, to say, okay, this is how you might begin to just collect your thoughts, just to begin to take those first tentative steps into maybe having a conversation, if not with Community Finance Ireland, with a community finance, an ethical finance, it was an interesting term you used there, organisation in the area that they're, and the country they work.
First thing we always point towards is our website, communityfinanceIreland.com. And we have an opportunity there to log contact details so that we will keep you up to speed with developments within our own fund. Now, I should say that Community Finance Ireland just happened to be the only Irish and UK member of a pan-European network of alternative banks and ethical financiers called FABEA. We've been involved since 2016. We've been on the board since last year. And this year, in September 2024, we'll be hosting the first ever conference on ethical finance, first ever European conference on ethical finance in Croke Park in Dublin towards the end of September. And this may be of interest to a lot of listeners internationally in terms of seeing how best practice ethical finance happens on the ground across Europe. And so if they register their details with us on the website, we will have them then on our mailing list and keep them up to speed with developments of initiatives like that as they transpire. But also there will be opportunities for community development activists to see the various case studies in terms of videos and indeed sample podcasts that we've done with some of our clients over the last number of years on that website as well. So I'd suggest that's what I suggest these organisations do.
Which is how you came to be on my radar, of course. Conor, yourself, some of your work, if people are interested in getting in touch and maybe finding out a little bit more, either yourself individually or what Rose Regeneration Trust are up to, what's the best way of getting in touch?
There's a couple of ways, Russell. I suppose the obvious one, particularly around the engine, if they want to visit the website at socialvalueengine.com. And also, I suppose, like most things now in terms of LinkedIn. So you'll find my details on LinkedIn. You'll find Ivan Annabelle, the founder of the Social Value Engine's details on LinkedIn about Rose Regeneration. And you'll also see there's a small LinkedIn page as well too around social value engine that you'll be able to find our details with. And happy to deal with any inquiries, have a conversation about social value for groups and starting their journey.
Dónal, anything else you want to plug from Community Finance Ireland's perspective?
Yeah, no, look, it just our mission is to ensure social impact is felt rather than just dreamt. So we would encourage anybody, individuals or organisations that are interested in learning more about what it is that we do and how perhaps they can replicate it in their local area. I mean, I had a conversation with a group of people from Manchester last week about doing something similar there. I'm going over to speak in Canada next month in the middle of March to talk to them about setting up a similar type organisation over in that part of the world. We were in Romania 2 years ago at the launch of a similar type organisation. So, this is the future. Social finance is the way forward, and we'd encourage anybody that has an interest in it to get in touch with us.
So that's Dónal Traynor, Chief Executive of Community Finance Ireland, Conor McGale from Rose Regeneration Trust. Really, really grateful for the time that you've lent me. Fascinating discussion. Look forward to hearing a bit more about the next phase of work that you're involved in together. Maybe sort of, come back around the mic again at some point in the future. We'll keep an eye out for the details of the conference and anything on the socials about the conference in Croke Park in September. And yes, I think you're probably right, actually. I think social finance probably is the future. So, fascinating few years ahead of us.
Thanks, Russell.
Thanks very much, Russell.
Thank you for listening to the Community Development Podcast. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at comdevtpodcast, COMMDEVT podcast. And to support the podcast and help it share learning, connect the workforce, and raise the profile and the merits of community development approaches, why not become a Patreon at patreon.com/the CD podcast. Thank you for listening to the Community Development Podcast. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at CommDevT Podcast, COMMDEVT Podcast. And to support the podcast and help it share learning, connect the workforce, and raise the profile and the merits of community development approaches, why not become a Patreon at patreon.com/the CD podcast.